Kicking off the morning for debate, the honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
Mr. Speaker, after practicing law for 30 years and being the Crown Attorney for the last 18 of them, I decided to dedicate myself to serving the people of the great riding of Brantford-Brant and across Canada. It is a privilege to rise in the House early today, although I am doing this with a heavy heart. For the first time in our history, the Prime Minister, whose current support is as low as never before, decided to invoke the extreme power to handle the local Ottawa crisis that he escalated by his poor judgment, ineffective leadership, divisive rhetoric, and non-science-based decisions. I want to make this point abundantly clear that I will be voting to revoke the invocation of the Emergencies Act. The constitutionally protected rights of speech and assembly are a cornerstone of our democracy. Canadian voices to be heard to both speak in support of or in dissent of any policies proclaimed by the Canadian government is sacrosanct. The right to protest peacefully is essential to a democracy. Obviously, the prolonged blockades in Ottawa and at border crossings were against the law, but the invocation to implement the Emergencies Act was completely unnecessary and, most importantly, did not meet the extremely high threshold as set out in the Act. Our nation has seen countless numbers of disturbances, protests, and blockades that all have been resolved without the imposition of this draconian piece of legislation. Critical infrastructure blockades of railways, pipelines, highways, and border crossings have been resolved through dialogue, negotiation, and effective police intervention. Without the suspension of our civil liberties, we witnessed the events and aftermath of 9/11 and the intentional storming of Centre Block, which resulted in gunfire. The primary focus of my speech is that this crisis is entirely the result of a vacuum of leadership for this Prime Minister. Leadership traits of effective political leaders include vision, strategic and critical thinking, authenticity, self-awareness, open-mindedness and creativity, flexibility, responsibility and dependability, patience, tenacity, and the pursuit of continuous improvement. Had our Prime Minister exhibited a fraction of these qualities, we'd all be enjoying this weekend with our families. Let's take some time to examine the failed leadership of our Prime Minister. At the beginning of the pandemic, he unnecessarily delayed the acquisition of vaccines. He signed a secret deal with China to make vaccines that the Chinese reneged on. He tried to implement unrestricted spending powers to his cabinet without parliamentary oversight. He has the dishonor of wearing the badge of multiple ethical violations, the most in our history, from the luxury family holiday freebie with the Aga Khan, the aggregation of the rule of law to mitigate charges against SNC-Lavalin for years of illegal and corrupt practices, and he intervened in the funding distribution for his friends in the We organization. This is the Prime Minister who proposes to be a feminist, notwithstanding he fired 2 strong women from his cabinet, including the first Indigenous Justice Minister for having the courage to speak truth to power and call out his bullying, unethical, and relentless pressure to interfere in a criminal prosecution. This is the Prime Minister who prorogued Parliament to protect his political interest. Every time his justification is different, but the goal is the same, to protect his own political career. This is the Prime Minister who deliberately wore blackface so many times as an adult that he cannot remember. A Prime Minister who traveled around the globe and gave away millions in foreign aid in the pursuit of a useless temporary seat on the UN Security Council. A Prime Minister and his ministers who swept under the table several sexual misconduct allegations in the armed forces. This Prime Minister's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been a moving target, cleverly designed to show empathy and support when it suits his political narrative. On May 20th, 2021, he made a definitive statement that he opposed mandatory vaccination laws. He stated, "We're not a country that makes vaccination mandatory." He also at that time opposed vaccine passports, saying they would be divisive. This really begs the question, what happened to that Canadian Prime Minister? He studied the polls which showed growing public anger aimed at the unvaccinated and calls for harsher measures. Now, we can never accuse this Prime Minister of never taking advantage of a good crisis, so what did he do? He called a completely unnecessary federal election in the middle of a pandemic at a cost of $610 million. His hubris and vanity saw a path to forming a majority government. Never mind that he could have spent that money on clean water initiatives, reconciliation projects, mental health initiatives, or simply investing in pandemic recovery. The first few weeks of the election were not kind to the Prime Minister. Unable to clearly articulate a reason for calling the election and slipping badly in the polls, he pivoted to save his political career and saw an opportunity to create a political wedge, dividing Canadians against each other, the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. At the start of the pandemic, on March 31st, 2020, he tweeted, "While many of us are working from the home, there are others who aren't able to do that, like the truck drivers who are working day and night to make sure our shelves are stocked. When you can, please thank a trucker for everything they're doing." Truckers who were once hailed by this Prime Minister as national heroes are now vilified. He refers to them as a small fringe minority. During the election, he used phrases such as "those people," anti-vaxxers, women haters, misogynists, racists, science deniers, and how can we tolerate these people? Now, during the protest, he described the truckers and their supporters as domestic terrorists. This is language shared by many in the Liberal government. I was completely stunned when I heard the member for Scarborough Rouge Park, a lawyer, and the parliamentary secretary for the Minister of Justice refer to the people outside this building as terrorists and miscreants. The PM's unquestionable contempt for these Canadians is pathetic. It is simply conduct unbecoming a Canadian politician, let alone a Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, when the trucks arrived, they had a legal right to park on the street in front of Parliament. They were directed there by the Mayor of Ottawa. They were legally protesting for at least 2 days and 2 nights in extreme weather conditions. What do we hear from the Prime Minister or any Liberal minister? Crickets. The Prime Minister has made no effort to de-escalate the situation, neither before his absence nor after. We Conservatives were listening to people. We were not afraid of truckers and their supporters. We were walking through the protest to get from one building to another. We read their posters. We talked to them. That's why we called on the Liberal government to sit around the round table to find solutions that would work for all and for good. The government ignored our initiative. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives also tabled a motion asking the government to release a plan to end all federal mandates and restrictions. A plan. After 2 years of the pandemic, but the Liberal NDP coalition voted against it. They don't have a plan. They don't plan to have one. Imposing powers of the Emergencies Act sets a dangerous precedent. It does not lead us to any constructive long-term solution. Plus, it was unnecessary, it is expansive, and will further divide the country. I have listened to what the Liberals had to say in justifying their decision to invoke the Act. The Prime Minister stated that he had to invoke because the situation could not be dealt with under any other law in Canada. And that's where, Mr. Speaker, he is deliberately misleading Canadians. The Act is very clear that it should only be used in a circumstance that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians.
Point of order from the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
When the member says that the Prime Minister is deliberately misleading Canadians, he knows that he should know that he cannot do indirectly what he can't do directly, and it's pretty clear what he's trying to do indirectly in this case. I would ask him, through you, Mr. Speaker, to retract those comments, as it would be unparliamentary to leave them on the record.
Thank the member for that. In that, he is correct. So I was asked the member for Brantford-Brant to adjust that sentence, maybe retract it and try a different verbiage there. The honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
The Prime Minister is using mixed language. The Act is very clear. It should only be used in circumstances that seriously endangers lives, health, or safety of Canadians.
The point of order, the honourable member for Kingston Islands.
It is important for the record, Mr. Speaker, that the member actually say that he retracts the comments. He didn't do that. He just attempted to continue on and say it a different way. He needs to say, I retract the comments.
The point of order is pretty clear. If it could retract it and maybe contract and then get back into it. So the honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
Obvious I offended the delicate ears of my friend opposite. I retract that statement.
You retract it.
Point of order from the member Kingston Islands.
The member has not taken your advice on 2 occasions now, and rather than answer the question, he is now attempting to engage in debate. And Mr. Speaker, you have an obligation here to enforce the rules of this House, and I would encourage you to do so.
Thank you very much for that. Once again, I'll just confirm. Maybe what I'll do is I'll ask the government house, the opposition House leader to maybe on the same point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member did retract it. He said it clearly, and I think if you checked it with the table, you'll find that out. Thank you.
I did hear him retracted. I think you were standing. The member was standing at the same time. So maybe I'll get him to maybe what I'll do is I'll get him to clarify and then continue. The member has about 1:36 left in his speech.
To make it abundantly clear, I retract that statement for the second time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Blockades are already in violation of the Criminal Code, Provincial Highway Acts, and any number of municipal bylaws and court injunctions. This was and still remains the purview of the police. They had all the tools necessary. The legal authority for the government to invoke this act is currently being challenged by both the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canada Constitution Foundation. They argue that the high legal threshold has not been met. They acknowledge the language used by the government that they see no civil liberty violation because the act is still subject to the Charter. The talking points that the Liberals extensively use argue that just because a process is supposed to obey the Charter doesn't mean it will. By that logic, the mere fact that the Charter exists should mean there will never be Charter violations. This is simply not true. The Prime Minister now has carte blanche to do what he wants to people who not only participate in blockades and the convoy, but to anyone merely suspected of being involved in sharing supplies. This is a dangerous precedent. The Prime Minister is normalizing the use of emergency powers. The most disturbing aspect of the Act is the broad, sweeping banking measures. Banks now have the authority to freeze bank accounts without court order. The Prime Minister now has the broad discretion to seriously mess with the finances of anyone ever suspected of being involved in the protests anywhere in Canada. Mr. Speaker, let me conclude with the following. There was no emergency that endangered the lives of Canadians or threatened the sovereignty of Canada. This was political overreach. This was a political emergency, not national. The Prime Minister's unjustified invocation of the Act is deeply problematic and will have lasting consequences. The public's trust in our democratic and financial institutions has been seriously diminished. Invoking the Act proves the Prime Minister's absolute, unreserved incompetence that made such an extreme measure necessary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is unbelievable that the member opposite is defending the foreign-funded groups illegally occupying our city, illegally blocking our key economic infrastructure, and openly flouting the rule of law. And this foreign-funded groups have made a mockery of our law and have held our men and women in uniform in contempt. Does the member does not agree with the Ottawa interim police chief who said this Emergency Act provided the police with the resources they needed to handle this situation? Senator Vernon Waite, who served as Ottawa police chief.
The honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
Lest I wasn't entirely clear with the member, and I thank the member for his question, we are a party of law and order. I made it, and listen to the laughter. There's such disrespect for this particular member who's trying to answer a question, and I have to be bothered by the heckling and laughter. It really speaks volumes to their character, Mr. Speaker. But in any event, I made it abundantly clear that we disagreed with some of the tactics used by the organizers of this protest. As a lawyer, I follow and hold in sanctosanct our Charter of Rights of protest and assembly. This was a failed leadership exercise by this Prime Minister and by extension to the Chief of the Police, who is now resigned. He had all the tools necessary under the Criminal Code, provincial statutes, municipal bylaws, and court injunctions. He failed to act.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable
The honourable member for Repentigny. I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Good morning. It's very early. And I'd like to thank the member for Brantford-Brant for his speech. He has just answered my question from the last time, saying that there was no legal vacuum. Everything was already in place. So I'd like to ask another question. What are the lessons we can learn from what happened over the past month?
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
I thank the member for that very important question. There are many lessons to be learned, and I hope that we decide that a national inquiry should be undertaken forthwith to take a look at the obvious levels of failed leadership and the decisions that were made. But most importantly, it comes down to taking a look at the litany of emergencies, the litany of protests, the demonstrations, the blockades, the world events that have impacted Canada, and how effectively police agencies and politicians across this great nation have effectively dealt with that without imposing this draconian piece of legislation that hasn't been used.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my colleague for his intervention. I'd like to ask him, though, if I could actually get this monitor half a block behind me and zoom it, I could show him the barricades that are still up in the Windsor area because the Ambassador Bridge blockade now has moved to city streets. So Mohammed couldn't get to school last week. Joyce, a child, couldn't actually get to her doctor's appointment because of the blockade. So the blockades have moved off the actual Heron Church Road. They are now blocking intersections. People can't go to work. Businesses are closed. What does he say to Mohammed and to Joyce, who have missed school, who have actually missed doctor's appointments? And who is responsible for that? Because what's happened is it's not normal. The blockades are displaced. The blockade is now on one of the most poorest neighborhoods in Canada. What does he have to say to Mohammed and Joyce and their lives?
Member for Brantford-Brant.
I say to my member, to my honourable colleague, and I thank him for his question, is speak to the Prime Minister. He's the one that created this atmosphere of hostility, division, and anger. We talk about being conciliatory and being members, honourable members of this House, that we need to have open dialogue and discussion. There's none of that. None of that happens with the Prime Minister and his cabinet. So that's who he needs to talk to.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. The honourable member